I still remember the bitter cold of the winter of 1206, when I stood by the Onan River surrounded by the gathered Mongol tribes. The sky hung heavy with frost, and the air trembled with the echoes of history being written. That was the moment when they proclaimed me Temujin as Genghis Khan, the ruler of all who dared to call these steppes their home. Few among them then could foresee that the sharpest edge I wielded would not be found in my sword or the thundering hooves of my cavalry, but rather in the shadows I cast upon the minds of men, a web of terror spun so tightly that even the strongest cities would crumble before the battle had begun. I had long studied the wisdom of ancient masters. Sun Tzu whispered across centuries that the highest form of warfare was to break an enemy's will without ever lifting a blade. I made this my gospel. As I looked upon the Silk Road stretching endlessly into the horizon, I knew my army's reach would be limitless, not because of its size, but because of the fear that would precede it, galloping like a phantom long before my soldiers arrived. My rise from a small tribal leader to the sovereign of the largest empire the world has ever seen was not merely a march of armies, but a mastery of perception. I began by uniting the squabbling Mongol tribes beneath my banner. Rivals such as Jamukha, my childhood blood brother, who once dreamed of ruling beside me, learned that mercy was not among my gifts. I offered my enemies one choice: submission or oblivion. Those who bowed lived. Those who defied me vanished, and their names dissolved like smoke on the wind. By the time my banners pointed westward, toward the Khwarezmian Empire in 1219, my name alone carried with it a cargo of dread. Merchants whispered stories of entire cities wiped from existence, of lands where no living creature remained. At Zhongdu, which the world now calls Beijing, I allowed survivors to flee. Their voices carried the tales I wanted spoken. Cities burning screams that pierced the heavens and streets flowing like crimson rivers. Refugees became my heralds, and their terror was my most faithful messenger. When my horsemen encircled Bukhara, its 30,000 defenders looked upon my forces with paralyzed souls. The weight of my reputation crushed their will before a single arrow flew. They surrendered, but I still unleashed my fury. Its library, that sanctuary of knowledge, was torn apart, and the scholars who once whispered wisdom were silenced forever. As I strode into the mosque, my voice rang out heavy with the judgment of divine purpose. I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me. But I was never a mere brute. My mind worked in layers. Long before my armies approached, my spies and informants, my vast YAM network, were already at work. They planted rumors and spread disinformation, whispering that my armies numbered in the millions, while in truth we rarely exceeded 100,000. They whispered in marketplaces, inns, and temples, and their whispers became roars in the ears of my enemies. This YAM system stretched like sinew across thousands of miles, with relay stations spaced every 20 to 30 miles. Messages could travel nearly 200 miles a day, faster than any kingdom's courier. My agents were not only scouts, but merchants, monks, and wandering astrologers slipping through borders like silent ghosts. One of my most valuable informants, Chu Kai, a Khitan, who masqueraded as an astrologer, fed me secrets of Chinese fortresses while reading the stars for their commanders. Years later, even distant travelers like the Venetian Marco Polo would marvel at my network, describing tens of thousands of horses and riders under my command, relaying my orders and spreading my whispers across the empire like wind across the grass, yet terror that was my masterpiece. After I seized Urgench, I ordered pyramids of skulls to rise from the ground, 24,000 skulls stacked high, to cast their silent accusation into the heavens. At Nishapur and Merv, the slaughter was greater still. My vengeance at Nishapur was personal, for my son-in-law had fallen by an arrow there. My daughter demanded blood, and I granted it. No breath was left to stir the air, not man, not woman, not child, not even the cats and dogs were spared. The city became silent, a tomb beneath open sky. I left my symbols behind as omens. 3 arrows driven into the earth warned that attack was near. A broken arrow promised mercy to those who surrendered before my wrath was awakened. My riders with blood-streaked bridles painted the horizon with the color of dread, so even the approaching wind carried my message. Allies and enemies alike understood one thing. I trusted no one completely. The Tangut people once served me well, but when I sensed a shadow of future betrayal, I erased them utterly in 1227. Their language, their art, their stories all were ground to dust beneath the hooves of my horses. The Jurchen Jin fared little better. Though they once bowed between 1211 and 1234, I dismantled them piece by piece. Even within enemy camps, I sowed seeds of disloyalty. I offered wealth and titles to commanders who betrayed their kings. Zhui Tianzhe, one of the Jin's finest generals, came to me like many others, and it was his treachery that delivered Kaifeng into my hands. By 1230, nearly a third of my military commanders were once my enemies, men whose loyalty I purchased with opportunity, and whose betrayal shattered their former master's defenses from within. I spoke to their captains with promises of safety. Behind my words lurked knives aimed at their kings' throats. I turned their own men against them, so that when they looked upon one another, suspicion gnawed at their hearts like rats beneath floorboards. They called me many things, but the Chinese had a proverb that captured the truth. The Mongol sword has 2 edges, one cuts the enemy, the other cuts the friend. I had become not just a conqueror of cities, but a conqueror of minds. Fear was my greatest weapon, but discipline, ruthless, unflinching discipline, was the mortar that held my empire together. Without it, even the vastest conquest would crumble into dust. From the very beginning, I understood that loyalty must not merely be encouraged. It must be demanded, enforced, and when necessary, carved into flesh. My soldiers knew this well, for I made it clear to all who followed me. Obedience was not a virtue, it was survival. Not long after I rose to power, I gathered my generals and wise men near Lake Baikal and established the Yasa, my code of law, born not of parchment, but of iron. It was a brutal code, yes, but it brought order to chaos and forged unity from the wild passions of the steppe. 36 offenses carried the price of death, not just murder or treason, but acts that offended the very spirits of the earth. To foul running water was to insult the sacred veins of the world itself. To prepare food with unwashed hands invited the wrath of the heavens. Even my most trusted commanders knew that my judgment spared no one. I remember the case of Jebe, the great archer, who had once shot my horse during battle. Though he stood before me condemned, he did not beg. Instead, he confessed with courage and offered his life. It was that bold honesty that saved him, and from that day, Jebe became one of my finest generals. Yet others, less fortunate, were broken in half, their spines snapped like dry reeds, their bodies severed at the waist before the eyes of their comrades. In 1214, I ordered such a punishment during the siege of Zhongdu for 3 cowards who fled the fight and left their brothers to die. To betray me was to invite not merely death, but spectacle. Spies and turncoats met ends that etched themselves into the souls of every witness. In 1219, as we moved against the Khwarezmian Empire, one unfortunate spy fell into our hands. I had him brought before the entire host, where the executioners flayed him, slicing away his flesh piece by piece, keeping him alive as long as possible, his screams carried on the wind like the cries of hunted animals. Even the bravest warriors trembled at the sight, knowing that this was the price of disloyalty. There were others like the Merkite spies of 1220. who faced a slower demise. We buried them in the burning sands, leaving only their heads exposed, their mouths sticky with honey, to attract the swarms of insects that descended in buzzing clouds. The slow torment of thirst, heat, and biting jaws devoured them inch by inch. I once declared before my assembled officers, a traitor's death serves two purposes. It ends one betrayal and prevents 1,000 more. The whispers of these punishments spread across every campfire and caravan trail, sowing obedience wherever my banners flew. But I reserved some of my most dreadful judgments for the arrogant wealthy, those who believed their gold could shield them from my justice. In Bukhara, after the city's fall, the merchants who had dared to resist me were gathered into the square like cattle. Before the watching crowd, my executioners poured molten silver into their eyes and ears, a fitting punishment for men who loved gold above all else. I heard their screams echo through the streets for 3 days, as if the very stones of the city wept. And in Samarkand, for those whose fortunes outshone even these merchants, we used molten gold instead. Greed, I made sure, would be paid for in the very metal they worshipped. In Balkh, I turned captives into shields binding soldiers together and forcing them to absorb the volleys of arrows meant for my men. Their blood soaked both sides of the battlefield, their bodies pierced from front and back, as if death itself could not decide which way to claim them. The poet Sadi Shirazi would later write, "The mercy of the mighty is far better than the justice of the weak." My justice, though, was not mercy, it was order carved in blood. When cities resisted, I applied the 7 steps of destruction, a system as precise as it was horrific. At Merv, after Tolui, my youngest son accepted their surrender. We divided the city's hundreds of thousands like cattle. Artisans and craftsmen we spared for their hands would build the cities of my empire. But the rest, men, women, and children, were executed in waves over several weeks. Each group was sorted by age trade and gender. My soldiers slew as many as 100,000 per day, their swords rising and falling like scythes in a harvest of flesh. Of the entire city, only 400 were allowed to live hand-picked to carry tales of my wrath across the world. Among them was the mathematician Al-Karaji, who would later write, "I saw death wear 1,000 faces, each more terrible than the last." Resistance brought collective punishment, for no family, no village, no bloodline could think itself safe if defiance blossomed within its walls. In 1227, in the freshly conquered Jin territory, a minor rebellion sparked near modern-day Beijing. I ordered that those responsible and their families be boiled alive in vast cauldrons, while their kin were forced to watch. Even the sight of the great iron pots glistening in the sun became enough to turn hearts to stone with fear. Zhao Hong recorded that people would tremble at the mere shadow of a kettle. My empire was held together by an arithmetic of terror. If one man dared to hide a fugitive, 9 generations of his kin would be slaughtered. In Afghanistan's Bamiyan Valley in 1232, a village of 12,000 was buried alive after one family harbored my enemies. Their writhing beneath the earth churned the ground for 3 days, while my soldiers poured water upon the soil to hasten its settling. The land became known as the Valley of Screams, and even the wind seemed to wail for years afterward. But the great lessons of terror were not complete without examples on a grand scale, lessons that would etch my laws into the bones of all who survived. In Herat, when rebellion raised its head again in 1229, I sent Chormakashan with 50,000 troops to dismantle the city brick by brick. For 6 long months, they tore down every home, salted every field, and poisoned every well. The once great library was burned to ash, its 12,000 volumes fed to the Hari River, like the scattered thoughts of a dying civilization. Of nearly 1 million souls, only 40,000 remained. One scholar recorded bitterly, "They made the learned eat their own words." Thus, through agony and order, I forged an empire where obedience flourished not from love, but from the certainty of what awaited those who dared defy me. Terror was not simply my tool, it was my kingdom's foundation. As my empire swelled beyond what even my wildest ambitions had once imagined, I came to understand that the hearts of men can be ruled far more easily by fear than by force alone. I made fear itself a living presence within my dominion, not just a shadow that followed my armies, but a force that arrived before my banners and lingered long after my soldiers had moved on. In every campaign, I orchestrated punishments that went far beyond mere vengeance. They were lessons, messages carved in blood for the entire world to witness. When rebellion stirred in distant cities, I dispatched my punitive forces with deliberate cruelty so that all would remember the consequences. It was the Arabic chroniclers who named it best, the Great Terror, and they were not wrong. Herat in 1229 stands in my memory like a monument to the depth of my resolve. The city dared to rise against my authority. I sent Chormakan, my trusted general, with 50,000 soldiers, not merely to suppress, but to unmake. Over 6 months, my warriors dismantled every building stone by stone. The intricate irrigation canals that had nourished the land for centuries were destroyed, their waters left to stagnate or spill uselessly into poisoned soil. The farmland was salted, its fertility murdered as surely as its people. We fed their library 12,000 precious volumes into hungry fires, their ashes carried away by the Hari River. The screams of scholars drowned beneath the crackle of burning wisdom. From a city of nearly 1 million souls, barely 40,000 were left to walk the ruins. One of their own, Al-Juwayni, would later write bitterly, "They made the learned eat their own words." To carry out such deeds, I trained men who knew no mercy. My executioners were not ordinary soldiers. They were craftsmen of death, my Yasakchi. Numbering in the thousands, they moved with my armies like a black tide recognizable by their hardened leather armor and red-painted faces. In 1223, when we advanced upon the Russian principalities, these men invented newer, faster methods to extinguish life. They built massive wooden platforms that collapsed beneath hundreds of captives at once, crushing bodies as easily as a smith hammers iron. The Russian chronicles whispered of my Yasakchi as demons cloaked in human flesh, so terrifying that even the sight of them could still the hearts of grown men. And so, my system of terror became a form of control so absolute that it birthed what some would later call the Mongol Peace. City after city opened its gates at the mere rumor of my army's approach, unwilling to test my mercy. In 1231, when I turned my gaze toward Goryeo, the kingdom of Korea, they surrendered without a fight, choosing life under my rule over certain annihilation. The Arab geographer Yaqut al-Hamawi captured the essence of it when he wrote, "The Mongols ruled through fear what they could never have held through love. The ripple of dread spread even to lands I had never set foot in. In Hungary, entire regions emptied as peasants fled at the whisper of my name, preferring to abandon their homes rather than face the horrors they had heard retold by trembling survivors. Long after my death, the mere mention of my army was enough to unsettle distant kingdoms. In time, historians would speak of my reign as one of paradox, a peace sustained by horror stability purchased through agony. Trade flourished, roads became safe, and merchants traveled freely across the breadth of my dominion, but always beneath the shadow of what would happen should even a single village dare to test the boundaries of my patience. The Chinese captured it best in their proverb, "The Mongol whip brings peace, but peace bought with blood is still peace." Even the earth itself held proof of my judgments centuries after the swords were sheathed. In 2019, they uncovered graves near my old capital, Karakoram mass graves, where bodies were arranged not chaotically, but in perfect circles, as though even in death my victims had been forced to maintain my order. These were not the wild remnants of battle. They were the carefully structured echoes of my punishments. And similar discoveries spread across the vastness of Central Asia bones, marked with the signatures of torture wrists shattered by restraints, skulls pierced by execution blades. What had once been recorded only by trembling scribes now lay beneath the archaeologists' hands as silent physical testimony. The modern historian Stephen Pow would give it a name my victims already knew well: the architecture of atrocity. For that is what I had built, not chaos, not mindless slaughter, but a system engineered with precision, designed to leave no doubt in the minds of rulers, warriors, or peasants alike. Resistance would be remembered only in the agony of its ending. I understood something others did not, that it is not enough to destroy an army or conquer a city. True mastery is to carve one's will so deeply into the bones of the world that even generations unborn would tremble when hearing my name whispered in the dark. To break a city is to break a people, not merely their walls, but their spirit, their breath, their very will to exist. I learned early that brute force alone would never suffice. No, to become master of empires, I had to master their fortresses, their clever defenses, their hopes. And so I studied the ways of siege warfare with the same hunger that I studied men's hearts. With each campaign, my tactics sharpened. I became not just a warrior, but an architect of annihilation. I remember standing before the gates of Zhongdu, what the world now calls Beijing, and watching as the city cowered beneath my gaze. My general Mukhali had encircled them in a ring of death, 50,000 riders sealing every escape like the tightening of a noose. No food entered. No hope escaped. We poisoned their wells with the rotting carcasses of beasts, and men alike fouling their water until it stank of decay. Disease soon crept through their crowded streets like a second army. When hunger gnawed at their bellies, they turned on their own. The criminals in their prisons were butchered first, their flesh devoured by neighbors desperate to survive another day. I let them rot for 374 days until their cries softened to whispers and their souls dissolved into madness. When at last my soldiers stormed the city, 60,000 more who had tried to flee were executed where they stood. The streets ran red as smoke blotted out the heavens. Li Zhengming, a poet among them, would write of how heaven itself seemed to weep at the sight. But Zhongdu was only the beginning. At Urgench, I perfected my craft. My son Chagatai stood at my side as we ordered the river Amudarya itself to serve us, diverting its waters to drown the city and its people. Those who did not drown were consumed by fire. My engineers, brilliant minds I had taken from conquered lands, unleashed counterweight trebuchets designed by the Chinese master Li Jie. We loaded them with barrels of burning naphtha and hurled them over the walls, turning streets into rivers of fire. The Arab chronicler Al-Nasawi recorded the carnage. The sky rained fire while the earth became a lake of blood. Of 1.2 million souls, we spared perhaps 50,000 artisans' useful hands that could serve my empire. Even Al-Khwarizmi's grandson, the great mathematician, stood among those survivors and later wrote bitterly. They brought mathematics to murder and precision to pain. With each campaign, my slaughter became methodical and arithmetic of death. At Nishapur, after its fall in 1221, my son Tolui oversaw a system of elimination I called counting death. The population, 1.7 million strong, was divided into groups of 10. For every 10, one was spared to spread word of my fury. The others perished. My Darugachi officers tallied their corpses as merchants tally coin. The Persian historian Juvayni would write, "They counted corpses like merchants count coins." My scribes recorded every ear severed from each corpse, 1.3 million ears sorted and strung like grotesque beads proofs to send to trembling rulers elsewhere. But conquest was not only flesh and blood, it was memory itself. At Bukhara, after I rode my horse into the Grand Kalyan Mosque and declared myself the punishment of God, we turned their wisdom into ashes. Marble columns were dismantled and fed to my horses as troughs. Their libraries, great works of medicine, science, and poetry, became fuel for campfires and bedding for stables. 12,000 scrolls burned. The poet Rudaki's verses were torn page by page before the eyes of his fellow scholars, who were then executed. The physician Al-Razi's works gone. I did not merely kill men, I killed memory itself. As Al-Mustansir lamented, they killed not just men, but memory itself. I knew that if I could starve their bellies, I could also starve their futures. When I turned toward the Jin dynasty, I launched what would be remembered as the Great Hunger Campaign. Between 1211 and 1234, under General Subutai, we swept across northern China like a plague. In the first phase, we burned crops across a 500-mile radius, creating what the Chinese would call the Black Belt. Then we poisoned over 2,000 wells using not just corpses, but potions brewed by my shaman's wolf's bane mixed with rotting horse blood. Lastly, we slaughtered their livestock, 2.7 million animals in Hebei province alone. In Henan, famine and disease consumed 90% of the population. Yao Sui would write, "Where the Mongol horse has stepped, no grass grows for 100 years." Even the bones they left behind bore the scars of butchery and cannibalism. Yet I did not rely on starvation alone. My engineers gathered from every land I conquered became my deadliest weapon. I formed the 100 Mines, a corps of siege masters drawn from China, Persia, and beyond. At Bamiyan, my engineer Wang Jiping delivered the Thundering Ram, an iron beast powered by gunpowder charges, striking gates with the force of 40 tons. 200 men wheeled it forward. Its blast, Rashid al-Din wrote, was louder than 1,000 drums. The gates of Bamiyan shattered in 3 hours. So terrible was its sound that nearby cities surrendered without ever seeing the machine. We birthed new horrors. At Kaifeng, my fire dragons spat their flames across the sky. Subutai, guided by the Chinese alchemist Li Ji, built mobile flame launchers, mixtures of saltpeter sulfur, and rendered human fat. Night became day as dragons of flame arched over city walls. Zhao Hong recorded in his diary, "Their fire-spitting machines made our strongest walls seem like paper, and our bravest warriors flee like children." So horrifying were the flames that over 30,000 defenders chose suicide rather than face my machines. But I struck not only at bodies, but at minds. During the siege of Volohai, my smith Karakai crafted Zhenjingjian's soul-shocking arrows. Hollow bone chambers inside each shaft produced eerie whistling cries as they flew. The defenders fled their posts in terror at the ghostly wails before a single blade reached them. Later, when archaeologists unearthed these arrows in 2018, even their hollow bones testified to the genius of my terror. I refined it all into what my commanders called the arithmetic of fear. At Merv, we counted ears as we counted lives. At Urgench, we crushed resistance with calculated drowning. At Zhongqing, we did not simply poison wells, we filled them with molten bronze to deny their use forever. We mapped silk roads, salt mines, and irrigation routes, and then broke each one like the spine of a beast. Li Sinchuan would write, "They understood that killing commerce was as effective as killing people." No army in history had wielded terror as a strategy with such precision. No empire before mine understood that numbers could be sharpened into weapons. I had transformed siegecraft into a form of mathematics, the calculation of submission through measured annihilation. My destruction was not chaos. It was designed. It was perfected. Victory over cities was never enough. To break an empire, one must break its rulers, not merely slay them, but erase the very foundation upon which their power stood. I came to understand that true conquest lies not only in the battlefield, but in the delicate art of dismantling thrones, families, and hierarchies, until nothing remains but hollowed names and haunted ruins. When the Khwarezmian Shah Muhammad II dared defy me in 1220, he fled before my armies like a frightened jackal. But I would not let him slip into obscurity. I unleashed my great hunt, dispatching 20,000 of my finest riders with one purpose: pursue him across mountains and deserts until there was no corner of the earth left for him to hide. For 9 long months we hunted him, driving him to a barren island in the Caspian Sea, where he finally died alone, stripped of title, kin, and dignity. When word reached me, I whispered I would have made him my doorkeeper, so the world could see how far the mighty can fall. At Zhongdu in 1215, I personally oversaw the systematic elimination of the Jin dynasty's nobility. My officers arrived not as conquerors, but as executioners with lists. Every noble family, every rank meticulously recorded. The Emperor Xuanzong was made to witness as his entire court, 2,000 souls, were slaughtered rank by rank before his trembling eyes. Those of imperial blood were suffocated beneath felt carpets, their deaths clean, without the shedding of royal blood as our ancient customs dictated. The lesser nobles were executed openly, their heads displayed to strip their bloodlines of all dignity. But death alone was not always sufficient. I devised rituals of humiliation that shattered not just flesh, but spirit. When the Tangut Emperor Xuanzong surrendered to me in 1227, I forced him into the 9 submissions, crawling before my horse, his forehead pressed to the dirt 9 times, while his nobles looked on in silence. Then his own court was made to spit upon him the final wound, not of steel, but of shame. My shamans taught me that to break a king's spirit is to kill him twice. After the sack of Bukhara, I allowed exactly 7 members of the ruling council to live, one for each direction of the compass, and one to remain behind as the last witness of their shattered city. I clothed them in fine silk, mounted them on swift horses, and sent them forth to distant lands, living emissaries of terror, carrying tales of my wrath like a plague that traveled faster than any army. One of them, trembling later, confessed, "They made me watch every death, remember every scream, and now I live only to tell their story." Yet sometimes death and humiliation were not enough. To ensure compliance across conquered kingdoms, I bound noble families into my bloodline itself. After crushing the Uyghur kingdom in 1209, I instituted what my men came to call the chain of blood. 27 noble families were forced to surrender their daughters as wives for my commanders, while their sons were taken as hostages to serve in my personal guard. Mahmud al-Kashgari, a Uyghur historian, recorded bitterly, "They bound us with chains of marriage stronger than any iron." By 1220, nearly half of my highest commanders were flanked by royal hostages, sons of conquered kings, who now called me father, and whose families dared not rebel while their blood sat beneath my watchful eye. The Jurchen nobility, too, felt the sharpness of my method. After their defeat, I divided each noble house into thirds. One group executed, one enslaved and sent to Mongolia, and one left behind to govern their broken homeland beneath my ever-watchful gaze. As the Chinese official Weishu recorded, "They split families like a butcher splits meat." But my most exquisite cruelty was reserved for the game of kingdoms. I forced noble families to compete in degrading tasks the losers executed, the winners forced to wield the blade against their own kin. Princes slaughtered princes, kings murdered their own brothers, until nothing remained but shattered dynasties desperate to serve me. The Jurchen chronicler Basili captured it best. They made kings into clowns and princes into puppets. Among the Khitan, I reduced nobility itself to mockery. Their captured elites were made to wear their ceremonial robes backwards while they shoveled dung from my stables. Their royal seals were melted and reforged as horse bits. Their ceremonial swords became nothing more than skewers for roasting meat. The historian Li Xin-chuan wrote bitterly, "They did not just kill nobles, they killed nobility itself." In the Song dynasty, I refined the ritual of dismantling aristocracy into the 7 steps of noble death. First, I stripped them of their silks and dressed them in commoner rags. Then I sheared their long royal hair into the Mongol warrior cut. Ash was smeared across their faces. Their family records burned before their eyes. Their ancestral tablets smashed. Their personal seals obliterated. And finally, their executions were carried out not by my officers, but by common soldiers, erasing even the honor of dying by an equal's hand. Zhao Gong would later write, each step removed not just dignity, but centuries of carefully cultivated authority. Among the Khwarezmians, I perfected what became known as the Great Reversal. I elevated the lowliest servants to rule over their former masters. Nobles who once commanded thousands now opened doors for the men who once swept their stables. The Arab historian Ibn al-Athir wrote, "They did not merely kill the mighty, they forced them to live as the meek." Even the palace walls whispered of their despair. At Urgench, archaeologists later uncovered graffiti scratched by captive nobles, one reading, "I, who once commanded thousands, now bow to he, who once cleaned my stables." No station was sacred to me, not even religion. In the Buddhist kingdoms of Tibet, I stripped their lamas of dignity. High monks were forced to carry supplies wearing their robes backward, chanting their prayers in reverse. The chronicler Chopel wrote that 342 senior lamas carried my baggage, their sacred hats crushed beneath the weight of grain sacks. Some monasteries burned their own holy texts, unwilling to see them desecrated under my boots. And for the children of the conquered, I forged a far more insidious fate. I raised them in my camps, taught them my language, my ways, and sent them back as governors of their own ruined homelands. The Armenian chronicler Kyriakos of Ganzach tells of one such boy, once a proud prince, who returned after 10 years, unable to speak his mother tongue, clothed as a Mongol, thinking as my servant. This was my empire, not simply built with steel and flame, but with terror that reached into the very soul of bloodlines. I reshaped not only borders, but legacies. And long after my armies rode on, my shadow remained as cold and endless as the steppe. Even as I stood surrounded by conquered kingdoms and broken dynasties, I knew my true victory was not measured by how many cities fell to my banners, but by how many surrendered before a single arrow flew. My greatest conquest was not land, it was the minds of men. Terror was my empire's true foundation, and long after my bones turned to dust, its shadow would still stretch across the world. Word of my terror spread faster than my armies. In distant lands I had never touched, peasants whispered my name as though it were a storm approaching from beyond the horizon. In Poland, Hungary, and the far reaches of Europe, entire villages burned themselves to the ground rather than face what they had only heard described in panicked tales. In Hungary, they said, the terror of the Mongols ran faster than their horses. They were right. In cities across Asia, mothers quieted their crying infants by whispering, "The Mongols are coming." Long after my armies had passed, the dread remained inherited, like a family heirloom passed from one frightened generation to the next. Even where my soldiers never rode, my presence ruled. Historians would call this Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, but it was peace purchased at a price few could bear. Yes, trade flourished along the Silk Road. Yes, merchants crossed my lands safely. Yes, scholars traveled from east to west without fear of brigands. But they all knew safety was guaranteed only so long as none dared challenge my authority. My peace was not built on kindness. It was a peace built with blood, as the Chinese proverb whispered, "The Mongol whip brings peace, but peace bought with blood is still peace." Even in my absence, the world continued to uncover the remnants of my rule. In Karakoram, my ancient capital, they unearthed mass graves, not random piles of corpses, but carefully arranged circles of the dead, their bodies still locked in the ceremonial order my executioners imposed upon them. They found similar graveyards scattered across to Central Asia, where bones bore the scars of systematic torture, wrists shattered by shackles, skulls split clean by execution blades. Centuries later, their silent testimony still echoed my hand's precision. The scholar Stephen Pow would call my work the architecture of atrocity. But I had never acted without calculation. Every act of terror was designed, every massacre measured, every humiliation orchestrated with ruthless intent. I turned bloodshed into policy and annihilation into an art. I had long understood what few others grasped: destruction could be engineered. During the siege of Zhongdu, I studied the enemy's fortresses. At Urgench, I rewrote the rules of flood and flame. At Nishapur, I refined slaughter into arithmetic. My officers did not merely kill, they counted ears, recorded corpses, and sent their tallies across my empire to broadcast my efficiency. Numbers speak louder than rumors, I often said. My generals' men like Subutai and Jebi mastered the lessons I taught. We identified not just armies to destroy, but economies to cripple. When we marched against the Tangut Empire, I commanded my strategists to compose the Book of Destruction, a detailed guide to erasing the foundations of an enemy's civilization. Irrigation systems, salt mines, silk workshops, all were marked for targeted obliteration. In Zhongqing, we slaughtered silk artisans, melted wells with bronze, and left their cities crippled for generations. Innovation followed me like a loyal horse. At Bamiyan, my siege masters deployed the thundering ram, a battering machine fueled by gunpowder charges that shattered iron-reinforced gates with force no city had ever withstood. At Kaifeng, my engineers unveiled the fire dragon, launching burning projectiles composed of saltpeter sulfur and even rendered human fat. Their flames turned night into day. Their shrieks drove men to madness. Zhao Hong confessed our strongest walls seemed like paper, and our bravest warriors fled like children. At Volahai, my soul-shocking arrows shrieked through the air, hollow bone chambers, producing ghostly wails that made defenders abandon their walls without ever facing my warriors. My terror needed no swords to cut down courage. Even the natural world bowed to my campaigns. When I shattered the Khwarezmian irrigation systems, I did not simply destroy cities, I altered the land itself. In the Fergana Valley, once green and fertile, my armies birthed a desert. Historians now speak of the Mongol desert effect, an unnatural drought confirmed by modern geologists that lingered for generations after my armies had passed. Where my horses galloped, even grass feared to grow. In Baghdad, under my grandson Hulagu, we carried my principles even further. We built pyramids of skulls arranged by age and gender, a grotesque order that mirrored the chaos we imposed. We sent advance warnings to enemy cities, bags filled with severed ears, blood-soaked children's toys, and the detailed accounts of previous massacres. Their horror often broke cities before we arrived. Ibn al-Tiktaka, an Arab chronicler, observed bitterly, "They arranged death like architects arrange stones. By 1260, long after my own death, my name still emptied cities. In some places, towns simply ceased to exist at the first rumor of approaching Mongols. Panic devoured them before our horses ever arrived." The chronicler David Morgan would later call it the Pax Mongolica, through trauma. And he was right. My empire was maintained by fear alone. In the centuries that followed, others studied my methods. Timur, whom some would call Tamerlane, modeled his conquests on my campaigns. Even Napoleon sought to learn from my sieges. The Ottoman strategist Nasu al-Mutrakchi wrote with admiration, "The Mongols taught the world that fear is the greatest weapon more potent than any sword." I did not merely conquer empires. I reshaped the very way empires think. I left behind not just ruins, but a new language of terror, a model for those who would come after me, whether they ruled on horseback or behind palace walls. My story was never merely one of swords, but of minds, a quiet horror that still echoes centuries later whenever the wind whispers my name. As the Persian historian Juvaini wrote, capturing what so many saw and feared, "They came, they sapped, they burnt, they slew, they plundered, and they departed.